Mishpatim?
Why do we what?
Why are we starting with the third Mishpat? We've already had two.
Actually, we had three.
We've had three.
After the striking Ten Commandments, with all its glory and generality last week, we had three very detailed laws. One, to make an altar of earth, at least at that point. And two, if you make an altar of stone, not to make it of hewn stone, because of a slight suggestion of violence, that the saw which cuts the stone would remind you of a sword cutting a person. And not to make an altar with steps, because of a slight suggestion that you're exposing yourself even though the Kohen wore pants. So we actually had maybe two or three, depending how you want to figure it.
They weren't so detailed.
Well, I don't say so much detail. There's very, very delicate issues. Like, it wasn't a case of anyone using a sword. It's just, this will remind you of a sword. In the Mikdash, you go from the one extreme of sweeping generalities to ultra-sensitive laws which don't seem to reflect normal reality, two of them. And then we go into a whole stream of everyday life laws in Mishpatim, that the generalities in Judaism must always lead to the particulars. How great and sweeping is God must also have a parallel of finding God in the tiny exactness of every detail in science or Torah. So our host's question is, why not include those other things with the Mishpatim? I would attempt to answer it by saying the two specific laws of the altar teach us two general classifications for all laws. There are two bad tendencies in human beings, ta'ava and ga'ava, an excess of pleasure and an excess of pride and aggrandizement. The flood generation is the pleasure principle gone mad, and the tower generation is the power principle gone mad. So our altar of God starts off with these two detailed laws. One, against any association with the sword while you're in the holy precincts, while you're trying to put your power trip together. And the other, not even a suggestion of bodily genital exposure while you're in a place which is to focus you on getting away from whatever is the animal with you yourself, so that you eventually can come back to it and sanctify it. Not that you're to give up power and pleasure, but you're to take the God element, which you then will intermix, and which will guide your power and pleasure. So that's how I would put it. That those two are examples of how far one has to go to probe out, or to root out, or to explore the power and pleasure principles within oneself, and then all the other mishpatim fit into those categories. Also, and maybe we'll actually start the text with this, what's the first thing in our text this week? The first thing of note. What would you say? No, there's things before that. What's the very first thing of note? I'll read the first part. The first item of note in the Parshat. The very first. I'll read you the first words. Now, in that, what's the first item of note?
It's continuation of something else.
It's what?
It's continuation.
Right. Okay, you're both right. The v. And these are the mishpatim. We normally have a v with a verb to change it from future to past or past to future in the Chumash. But here the and is not what we normally have to start something. For example, do we have the words Elah HaDevarim without the and? Any place in the Bible? Think hard. There's a place in the Bible where we have those same words, Elah and Elah, with Elah HaDevarim without above. Where?
Well, Rashi refers to it.
Yeah, but where? Forget Rashi. Try to find it yourself. Where do we have Elah Devarim starting something? Elah HaDevarim without above.
Moshe, no?
Something to do with Moshe, yeah.
Yeah.
That's Deuteronomy. Elah HaDevarim. Okay, Elah HaDevarim Asher Moshe. So these are the words, starts Deuteronomy. No, Vav, it doesn't say Vet Elah HaDevarim. Why? Because it's a new subject matter. It's a new book. Now, if this is a new Parsha, a new section, and it certainly seems to be, Mishpatim, as you point out, we had a few things about the altar, then we go on to all these laws. So the V obviously is to connect it with that which went before. One explanation of the connection is what I just said. That after all the sweeping generalities of the 10 axioms, the 10 commandments, whatever you want to call them, we now must get into the beginning of all the detailed laws by which those generalities are brought into every aspect of everyday life, not left as generalities and life goes on separately. Very nice, except for the problem that was raised. So why those 2 laws of the altar first? Maybe bring this right after that, and then bring the laws of the altar. So I tried to show that the laws of the altar illustrate the 2 categories, but there's something else. The Talmud says that the V is to connect the legal system to the altar. The altar is purposely put before the legal system because there are to be connections between the legal system and the altar. And what is the specific physical connection between the legal system and the altar? Not that we sacrifice the judges, but what?
The Sanhedrin.
The Sanhedrin, which is the legislative and judicial body of the Jewish people, sits where? Right next door to the temple, to the altar. And this is not coincidental. This is learned out as a legal requirement from the juxtaposition of the altar and the legal system. That the Sanhedrin must sit near the Mizbeach, the altar, the temple. Why? Well, why should it? You don't make any sacrifices there. I could say in case someone making sacrifices has a legal question, implying that they should be handy for ritual questions in the temple. But there's probably something much broader than that.
One goes with the other.
One goes with the other. What's the idea?
Emphasize the spiritual dimension.
The spiritual
Strength.
dimension must permeate the legal dimension. Do we have a statement somewhere in the Chumash that indeed, if the spiritual dimension does not permeate the legal dimension, no matter how civilized the society may appear on the surface,
No.
it's a fake Peyton place, huh? Where? I'm sorry? Yeah, where? Does anyone know the source for that? There's a clear statement in the Bible that a place, no matter how civilized and organized, is really just animal corruption if there is no God awareness in that place.
So don't.
That's where we see it. True, they have their laws, but it's stated very clearly.
With Abraham and Sarah, where he said there's no God in this place,
Right.
so he knew they'd take his wife.
Very good, Ruth. When the Philistines aren't coarse, vulgar people like the Egyptians. They're more like the civilized Western man, right? Of Las Vegas or Paris or Golders Green, wherever. And they take his wife, thinking it's his sister, and they say to him, how could you do such a thing to tell us that it's your sister? One of us might have done it wrong, referring to the king. Avram says, look, I know, Ein Yirat Hashem b'makam hazeh. There's no God awareness in this place. They would take me, kill me, and grab my wife. I'll find a legal way to do it, a sophisticated way, but it'll be done. So there is a precedent for the concept that the legal system, the Mishpatim, the Sanhedrin, must be adjacent to the altar. Now, the altar resembling korbanot, not resembling, on which korbanot are brought. Korbanot is from the karev, that which brings man close to God, also serves another function. By bringing man close to God, it elicits God's love and replaces God's justice or judgment with his love. And that is also the function of the Sanhedrin. We have a saying that when justice is done down below by the Sanhedrin, midat hadin, then there is no need to arouse midat hadin upstairs. That somehow in the course of courts doing a good job on this earth, heavenly wrath is no longer necessary. So the court has that function, and the Mizbeach has that function, to somehow arouse God's love. Some of the sacrifices are described as sweet savor, pleasant in God's eyes, and to turn away God's judgment. Now, God has quite a few names in the Bible. Some of the names denote his judgment in Kabbalistic tradition. Some denote his love. For example, Elohim, the name which also is used for judges, for high secular people, like the sons of Elohim took the daughters of man. It can simply mean the local lords having the first night of anyone who gets married, as was a custom until recently, which Jews suffered from. The word Elohim does not necessarily mean God. And God uses that name in his aspect of justice or of the impersonal, seemingly uncaring Lord of nature. Elohim, if you remember, is 86, which is Hateva, which is nature. That is a word of judgment. It has an abbreviated form which denotes the opposite, love. In Psalms 52, El, Aleph Lamed, denotes God in the aspect of love. It's the 52nd Psalm. Or Chesed. That term is used more than love. The other name of God, Yud-Kei Vav-Kei, Hashem, Shem Havaya, is a name of love and relationship. In its abbreviated form, where it's just a Yud and a Hey, Yasor Yasrani Ya, Lamavas, right? Lo Musarani, something like that. God, in his aspect of Yud Hey, has afflicted me mightily, but has not handed me over to complete death. So we see that abbreviated form of the Shem Havaya denotes judgment. All right? So we have two names of judgment and two names of kindness or love. Now the plot thickens. The Mizbeach, the altar, is to bring about love. Chesed, from God to man. It's always there, but it's to make it manifest, obvious. What is Mizbeach in Gematria? Mem is 40, Zion is 7, Beis is 2, and Chet is 8. 57. What is 57? Heinz Foods, yeah, varieties. Heinz Company was somewhat anti-Semitic, but somehow it got turned around and it had the UO. Heinz was the symbol of good kosher food in the United States. You never know how these things
They
really
chose the right number.
Yeah, they chose the right number. So who knows? So this turning to love, maybe through aggression, even through killing the animals and so forth, could be like the Heinz story of 57 varieties, is the function of Mizbeach. So Mizbeach is to bring out the two names of God which indicate kindness or love. Again, those two names are Havaya, Hashem, which is how much? 26.
Yeah.
And the other name of love is El, which is how much? 31, which totals?
57.
57. Now, the Sanhedrin, which is supposed to bring down God's aspect of kindness, there are two Sanhedrins, basically, which sit in the temple. One of 71 and one of 23. Sanhedrin Gedola, Ukatana. And that itself may be a hint that they're called Sanhedrin Gedola Ukatana, because one is to enlarge on God's name, so to speak, to change the Yah, which denotes God's wrath and anger and punishment, to enlarge it and turn it into Chavaya. And then the other Sanhedrin may reflect its name, the small Sanhedrin, the process of diminishing the other name of God, Elohim, to turn it into El, which again changes it from judgment to chesed, to kindness. Now, where else do we have in the Bible this idea of great and small? In the Bible itself. Where do we have great and small appearing in the Chumash? By Bilam. It says, I cannot speak, right, about the Lord my God, great or small. Because Bilam wants to do the opposite process, to enlarge the El, to make it Elohim into Din, and to diminish the Shem Havaya, the 26, into Yah, which is Chesed. All right? All this Kabbalistic lore is from Reb David Yehuda Frein, author, Sopper Fellow, author of the Sefer Alufei Yehuda. I thought it was most interesting. Okay, so that's another reason for the Va. We've just about done with the Va now, comparing the Sanhedrin to the Mizbeach. Okay, let's go beyond the to Elah. All right. The Elah, of course, also has such a hint in that the name El, the God of kindness, is in Elah, and the need to add a hey to Yah, to have the name with two heys, the Shem Havaya, is also there. So the Elah, and these are the statues which you shall place before them. Now, if I wanted to tell you about God's laws, how would I start the first sentence? I would say, these, we dealt with the end already, these are the statutes, Mishpatim, of God. Or these are the laws of the Torah. Or these are the laws for the Jews. When I add that phrase, which you should place before them, I obviously intend more than just saying these are the laws. Which you should place before them is apparently a very important condition to the giving of the laws, besides just listing the laws themselves. The simple meaning is you should place before them that God's telling Moses to place these laws before the judges, because many of the subsequent laws are basically not so much laws of the people as laws of the judges, how they are to administer the judicial system. But taking it in its broader sense, which you should place before them, does anyone recall what, I believe Rashi brings it, what Chazal say, which you should place before them? When do you, Pam, when do you place things before someone? When do you place things before someone usually?
When they're more important.
Yeah, what do you mean you place it before them? Like, what do you place before people?
You offer it.
What do you place before people, for example?
Food.
Food, right?
Things, yeah.
You like nice food, you fancy. How do you like to serve food, Pam? Just put it down? And
No, gracefully.
gracefully?
Kavod.
Why?
The eye,
Why?
as a sense of honor.
Sense of honor,
They expect
Jess?
something, they're not animals, they, as a sense of aesthetic.
Aesthetics. I mean, do you eat the aesthetics?
No,
You need them
but
for your
the
vitamins,
the
your
food is
protein.
tastier.
The
sight,
tastier.
the sight.
He says a sense of honor. When you eat yourself, do you bother to set it nicely? To make it look
Not
pretty?
as you would with a...
But you do. You do, right?
But you evaluate yourself, so you have to...
Why is that? Somehow the whole experience of eating is transformed. I can take that same piece of meat, just throw it on a paper plate. It's properly cooked, it's fine meat. And it's quite different than served on nice china, and the potatoes are just slopped down, but they're at the right distance and the right shape, and the salad's in a little salad bowl. Well, it's nonsense in a way. From a practical, communistic, Israeli socialist perspective, it might be nonsense. But from an aesthetic, someone
Quality
invites...
of life.
Huh?
Quality of life.
That's called quality of life by the secular society, which doesn't appreciate real quality of life. We say putting a bracha with the food is real quality of life. Reb Soloveitchik once spoke on it. He says, why do people care about things like that? About dressing for dinner, a silly thing, to stuff your mouth. You have to wear a suit and tie in certain hotels. No one admitted without tie and jacket into the dining room as though it's something really holy and significant and important rather than just animal lust. Because why does man do this? Because man is ashamed of being an animal. In the Derech Eretz Pelishtim, in the Philistine civilization, which prides itself on its cultural refinement, they're still stuffing their mouths and enjoying the food with relish, like a dog does, like a cat does. So man hides it. Man combines with it what he thinks are human, higher, elevated things, like pretty dishes and dressing nicely and napkins, soft candlelight, right, Pam, and wine, right? The whole scene. And he feels somehow that his animal act is transformed into a human act, into a civilized act. But it's a big fake out. When you see those guys go for the food, they go for it the same way the guy downtown grabs his turkey leg or falafel, but they're playing a game because they feel ashamed.
According to society.
Yes,
it
yes,
is. So
yeah.
you have to say...
Yes, but it's a mere veneer, a klipa over what's going on. And whereas the Jew, he says, doesn't just cover up in a pretty surface his animal impulse, but he transforms it into a holy act by incorporating it with God as its source, and God is the source of all his life, with brachas before, brachas afterwards, and the kosher laws. It doesn't always work by the Jews, too, to be candid, and you can watch all the guys going to the kosher restaurant, basically doing an animal act and knocking off the benching. But at least ideally, this can really give depth if it's done with the proper sensitivity and concentration. Else? Dishes, bencher, and what would they eat with?
Chopsticks.
Would you serve them with chopsticks or not? Would you use chopsticks or not? A delegation's coming from the Hebrew University to China. You're sent ahead to prepare a kosher meal.
I don't think
Because it
I
won't
would.
look good for the donors if it's not kosher and so forth. And would you serve them chopsticks?
If they were kosher, why not?
Yeah.
Would you or wouldn't you? These are very important people,
So they
big donors.
Well, they wouldn't have to eat
They wouldn't
that.
expect to eat with a knife and fork in China.
Well, these people don't know from these things. They're busy making money. They have no
All right, if you want to say knives and
We
forks.
didn't rule.
Yeah. Knives and forks. That's what I wanted to say. Right? Knives and forks.
That's what you-
Why would you give them knives and forks? Because you want them to enjoy the meal. If you're serving this beautiful meal and nice pieces of meat and everything, and they've never used chopsticks in their lives, and they're busy people in a hurry, and they have no time to learn such a thing. So you spoil the meal if you don't serve it right.
Or you can serve them glad kosher Chinese food with chopsticks.
Right, if they're used to it again. And the Chinese restaurant I would also prefer for. I'm not interested in submerging my identity and becoming a Chinese. I just like they cook certain things in a nice way. I like to taste them. I don't have to become a Chinese to do it. Now, and similarly, if you were serving a meal in the States to Chinese people, you might offer them chopsticks. People would just arrive because they're not used to a fork. You want it to be pleasant for them. Now, hear me well. If the Torah is compared to food, people will be hungry in the world to come and not for bread, and they'll be thirsty and not for water. And not by bread alone does man live, but he needs food of the Spirit. So it must be served with the kind of utensils which he's used to and which he's comfortable with. And therefore I would say from this pasuk stems a major thesis in a recent book by Rabbi Mendel Lewitis, Principles and Development of Jewish Law. I happened to pick it up last week. 2 weeks ago I met him. And I always seem to pick up what's relevant to the Parsha. Maybe Divine Providence works that way. And it turns, but I didn't attach it into the Parsha. I just thought we're talking about law. Here's a nice book on Jewish law. Very nice book. But then it occurred to me yesterday that what he's saying is actually the theme of this Parsha. Rashi says you must serve the Torah. It's not enough to give the Torah to the Jewish people. It must be served up to them like physical food in an attractive and pleasant and amenable setting. How do you do that? Well, I'm not used to eating with chopsticks. I'm not used to dealing with the tools of the 13th century. If the Rambam wrote a book which stems out of a social context where people's understanding of reality was based on Aristotelian logic and Aristotelian physics, and their feelings were conditioned by such a society, the book he writes, The Guide to the Perplexed, while it will contain many wonderful and great ideas and much information, is still for somebody who's a little more of a professional and is willing to take the course and learn to eat with the chopsticks. But the person who's used to modern modes of thought, whose influences are Freud and Bergman and Einstein, not Plato and Aristotle. So such a person wants his food served in such a way that he can eat it with his utensils and with the kind of aesthetic surroundings he's used to. So therefore, in every age, the Torah has to be rephrased into a new language. The physical behaviors required, the laws are the same, but the approach to them and the understanding of them and the expression of them and what is stressed and what is not stressed and which authorities you tend to look to for your guidance will vary with each culture and each age. That is Rabbi Lewitis' thesis. And Rabbi Lewitis claims in this book a very interesting thing. He says that a right-wing Haredi Torah society, the Yeshivische Welt, or as it calls itself, the Torah Welt, that society is not authentically traditional. It's not authentically traditional because its inflexible, non-contemporary mode of doing things is itself not traditional. That throughout the ages, the rabbis were involved in and conversant with the language, modes of thought, values, and knowledge of their times. The idea of rabbis who are not such is non-traditional, is not from. And then the rabbis could in turn relate to the people.
That's true.
Rav Hirsch was able to plunge himself into modern culture and civilization and science in every way, and then rewrite the Torah, rewrite it for modern man. Maimonides was able to plunge himself into the equivalent milieu of his time and rewrite the Torah, and so forth. And every door of a door, we have to tell it to our sons, each according to his temperament. So Rabbi Lewis' thesis is that what has happened in our day, it's the most interesting book, is that the so-called Orthodox Torah leaders have abandoned Jewish tradition in this respect, leaving it to the conservative and reconstructionist to inauthentically, without accepting the basic principles of Torah and Halacha, such as the divine origin of the Torah, for them to adjust it to modern times, since the real authentic experts aren't doing their job. Very interesting, though. Now, as long as we're on that subject, I would suggest one other book for a general, maybe two other books for a general overview of Jewish law. One is called Not in Heaven by Rabbi Dr. Eliezer Berkovitz, where he speaks again of the interplay of revelation, tradition, and common sense and logic in determining Jewish law. The Talmud often says, why do I need a verse? Svarahi. It's logic, it's common sense. The Torah is not to tell me that which I should think about myself. The Torah is to add on things which I won't think about myself. And another book I would recommend, where again the whole system has been rephrased in modern language and patterns of thought, is Jewish Law and Decision Making, a Study Through Time by Professor Aaron Schreiber of Temple University. He is a professor of law who has taken all of Jewish law throughout the ages and put it into orderly form, historically and conceptually, for a 20th century law school student. This is basically a law school textbook. These are two excellent works on the theme. Of course, Rav Herzog did the main institutions of Jewish law, and we have many other great books, but I'm trying to show you a few which most people are not familiar with. Now, again, to illustrate possibly how modern scholarship works, let's go into our first law now. So we did this subject, we're already, we can finish one verse. We did the va, and these are the laws which you should put before them, the idea of putting before. The first law is, when you purchase kisikna eved ivri, a Hebrew slave, sheish shanim yavod, 6 years he should work. Vashvias, and at the beginning of the 7th year, yetzei lachavshi chinam, he should go out free, without paying money. What is this law talking about? A Hebrew slave. How does that happen if someone's a Hebrew slave?
Like they used to have.
If he stole a Hebrew.
If he stole, what happens then? If
He's a
stole?
debtor.
Yeah, wait. Not he's a debtor. That's exactly what I want to. This is not the state of Israel where they throw people in debtor's prison or
He does
dickens.
anything to which he has a debt.
No,
He
no, it's not. If he's done a
Slave.
crime. Excuse me.
Wouldn't it be more accurate for at least one part of it? A man could sell himself into a servant relationship, not really a slave.
Right, we
That word
could
is
call it
bad.
servitude. Let's call it. So wait.
To work on-
Right. All right. So there's two. We've heard two ideas now. That a status of Eved Ivri, a Hebrew servant, can arise either through the court selling him. I don't believe they sell him for a debt. They sell him only if he stole and cannot pay back.
He
Yeah,
sold
that's what I'm
himself.
Or the second case is he sold himself. Now, we're going to have now a whole bunch of laws here. Do they apply to both of these cases or only one?
How do you mean that?
Just that.
Jewish and
Do they? No, we're not talking about non-Jewish servants. It says plainly Eved Ivri, a Hebrew servant here.
Yeah, there is no other
We're-
kind of servant.
Yes, there is. There's Eved Kanani, a Canaanite servant.
He must convert before he can be your slave.
No.
We had that this morning.
No.
Eved Ivri.
No, he does not convert completely. He partially converts.
Right.
He is not a full
He
Jew.
may not continue allowed to
But
worship.
whatever his details are, there is such an institution called Eved Kanani. He has a completely different set of laws than Eved Ivri, a Hebrew slave. So there are two kinds of slaves. And within a Hebrew slave, there are two ways you get to become one, as we just mentioned. Our portion here is only talking about Eved Ivri. Later in the portion, we will discuss Eved Kanani. That is beyond dispute, because that's the text. But there are two types of Eved Ivri. And what I'm asking is, does this portion with its laws, for example, going free in the 7th year, and whatever else is here, that if he doesn't want to go free, he can pierce his ear, that the master can give him a Canaanite woman to breed with, use him as a stud. Does this apply to both types of Hebrew servants, or to one type? Any guesses?
One type.
Criminal,
Hmm?
right?
What?
One type.
What are the two? One from a crime and one from a debt?
Debts for it, and we don't sell for debts. What, I'm sorry?
It's the same here.
You would say it's the same.
It's the same.
Does anyone know what Rashi says?
I think there'd be a difference.
The debts, you cancel after every Shemitah year.
Well,
It goes for both.
yes.
For
For both,
stealing
you
and
say.
selling, you'll say. It goes-
First of all, Rashi says Eved Shehu Ivri, because you might say a Hebrew slave means the slave of a Hebrew. So Rashi says you can't say that. It means a real Jewish slave here, okay? But then Rashi also says, one second, Kisigna, when you acquire, miyad bent in, Rashi says, from
Through the bed,
the court,
so when-
Shemarachu b'gnei who sold him for his theft, as it said, next chapter, if he doesn't have the money to pay back. This is not a debtor, this is a thief. I was right. V'nim kar b'gnei bato, he shall be sold in his theft. Oh, maybe it is referring to someone who sold himself, Rashi says. All right, because of his hard circumstances. All right, so maybe it is. Avo mecharu betin lo yatsa b'sheish shomer. So Rashi says later on in Leviticus 25 we again have laws of the Hebrew slave. We also have them in Deuteronomy, by the way. It says when you're poor, your brother will get poor from you and be sold to you. So there it's talking about one who sells himself because of his hardship, right? So what is it here when you buy a Hebrew slave? It doesn't say when he sells himself, it says when you buy him. It's when the Beis Din sells him. So Rashi says our laws here, for example, 6 years he shall work, in the 7th he shall go out, do not apply to one who sells himself. I can sell myself for 100 years if I want. Right? That's what Rashi is saying. But if the court sells me because I stole and couldn't pay back, that's limited to 6 years. All right? We'll see here. Very interesting Rashi. How does Rashi know that? Rashi knows it because it says it elsewhere. Rashi makes up little himself. He selectively takes sources, and it's always interesting to go back to the source itself and see if there's other sources who disagree. In my own opinion, I think there's much too much stress on Rashi in Torah society, as though if Rashi says that that's the only opinion and that's the interpretation, it's certainly one of them. But there's the Ramban, who frequently disagrees with him, the Ibn Ezra, Rav Hirsch, the Barbanel.
Kabbalistic.
Yeah, the Lubavitcher Rebbe pushes Rashi, but I don't see the need to push it so much. It's wonderful. He was wonderful, but he's one of a pantheon. We were not oriented to worshiping one Rebbe or one Rosh Yeshiva. Do not necessarily have to worship one of our ancient sages either, as opposed to others. So Rashi gets it from the Mechilta. What's Mechilta? Anybody know?
There are two Mechiltas, you said?
Hey, you remember it. Pretty good. I didn't know it myself till this year, so that's pretty good to remember. Rashi gets it from something called the Mechilta. What is the Mechilta? What is it? Do you remember? The Mechilta is a midrash, a halachic midrash, one that doesn't deal so much with exegesis as it will deal with exegesis related to legal matters. And it is the halachic midrash on Exodus. And it's called always the Mechilta de Rebbe Yishmael. And that's what Rashi knew about. But there was another Mechilta, which Rashi did not know about. It was called the Mechilta of Reb Shimon ben Yochai. It's also called the Mechilta, but a different version of the Mechilta attributed to the Rashbi, Reb Shimon ben Yochai, instead of to Reb Yishmael. Now, the plot thickens. This Mechilta was known to our Sephardi brethren, but not to we Ashkenazim. The Ramban mentions it, the Ramban's son. And so it was virtually a lost work, other than the quotations from it, until about 90 years ago. Something like that. Then, 90, 100 years ago, when large fragments of it were found by Professor Schechter in the Geniza in Cairo, along with many other wonderful documents. And then the Jews at that time, the Ashkenazic Jews, who were maybe the leaders in Talmudic scholarship, or at least so proclaimed by themselves, they suddenly made contact with a community which they had never really had contact with in the late 1800s. Do you know which? Huh? Yemenite. And lo and behold, when they got to the Yemenites, they found that the Yemenites had a very elaborate medrash called Medrash HaGadol. And that medrash is a restatement, basically, of this Mechilta of Reb Shimon ben Yochai, quoted by earlier Sephardic rabbis, like the Ramban, and found partially, I believe, by Schechter in the Geniza in Cairo. Okay? Then, one of the men who I most revere, who I consider one of the greatest Torah scholars of the century, Reb David Tzvi Hoffman in Germany, besides his being a gadol in Torah, he became an expert in university-type Jewish scholarship, because that was the language and mode of thought and exploration of our age, and the Torah had to be recast in it. Plus, it was used as a vehicle to attack the unity and authenticity of the Torah. So he began exploring all sorts of texts, unknown to traditional Gedolei Torah of the yeshiva world, to work them out, using both modern scholarship and his Torah knowledge. And he came up with a theory that the two Mechiltas reflect two basic different approaches to the Torah and Halacha, which were those of Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Akiva. Okay? And yes, Bar Yochai was the Talmud of Rebbe Akiva. So he said the Mechilta of Reb Shimon ben Yochai is another way of saying the Mechilta of Rebbe Akiva. And we went through this before, but their basic difference in approach was that Rebbe Akiva tended to view the Torah more mystically, as a special code language between God and Moshe, which every little symbol has tremendous meaning, and you do not expect it to express itself in normal human parlance, in normal human terms. It was given all at once as a miraculous entity, okay? And we must analyze everything because it's given to be so used. Rabbi Yishmael has a different approach, that the Torah was given piece by piece throughout the desert sojourn, that the Torah speaks in human language. Dibra Torah Kashon B'nai Adam is Rabbi Yishmael's principle. Rabbi Akiva does not accept it. And therefore, since the Torah will use normal human ways of speaking, you do not necessarily darshan, interpret every little word, or certainly not every little letter, or so forth. If you show it's a stylistic thing, okay? These are two different approaches to the Torah. Rabbi Yishmael, therefore, will tend more to use the oral tradition for laws, because he doesn't assume that it's necessarily all interpretable from the written statement. Now, what Reb David Tzvi Hoffman claimed is that what we call the Mechilta of Rabbi Yishmael basically reflects the views of Rabbi Yishmael. And what we call the Mechilta of Reb Shimon ben Yochai basically reflects the views of Rebbe Akiva. Now, the only problem with his grand thesis is that no one ever tested it to see if it works. Now, you can come up with a whole theory, but you have to make an experiment or test to see if it's really true. If indeed the two Mechiltas reflect two basic approaches to law, how would you test it? By taking a specific law in the Torah and seeing how each of the Mechiltas approaches it, and then seeing if there's some pattern that you can determine in the different ways they approach it. So this was done very recently by a professor, Tzvi Ari Yehuda, who I believe came from Spot and is now somewhere out in Ohio, at Yeshiva University. He went through the two Mechiltas. I believe his PhD thesis was around 1962 or 82. I may have it here, just a second. 1974. He called it the two Mechiltas on the Hebrew slave, and he very convincingly demonstrated that Hoffman was right. He isolated 35 elements in the legal structure regarding the Hebrew slave, then made tables of comparison showing how each of the Mechiltas dealt with it, and gave lots of analysis as to why, according to these patterns, which I just mentioned, of the two schools of Rebbe Akiva and Rebbe Shmuel. Now, anyway, so Rashi just said that our portion only speaks of one who was sold by the court, because the other one's spoken of in Leviticus. That is true according to the Mechilta which Rashi had, the Mechilta of Rebbe Yishmael. But the other Mechilta, the Mechilta of Shem ben Yochai, says it refers to both of them. And that all these laws, such as piercing his ear, and the 6 years, and staying till the Jubilee, and giving him a Canaanite wife for breeding purposes, apply as well to one who sold himself. And he goes down the three sources in Deuteronomy, Leviticus, and Exodus to show how each of the Mechiltas, consistent with their way of learning the Torah, learns each of the three sources. Okay? And I think that may be about enough on it for this point. I just want to see if I have one of the charts here. They did. Second. Yeah, I'll run briefly through the points, just to show you how he did this. I'm not going to go through his whole work, but a little bit. All right, he found 35 points. When you buy a Hebrew slave, there's a drasha. When you buy blue and white. When you buy a Hebrew slave, okay? Try to buy a Hebrew servant, not a non-Jewish one. That does not appear in the Mechilta of Rebbe Shmuel at all. It does appear in the Mechilta of Rebbe Shimon ben Yochai, and then he explains, according to the systems, why. One appears in one and not in the other. Okay? It comes out, as I remember, that there's a controversy between Rebbe Shmuel and Rebbe Akiva as to the nature of the relationship between a Jewish man and a non-Jewish slave woman, a Shifcha Kananit, who, as you mentioned, is like part convert. Rebbe Akiva views her as a prohibited relationship, which is only specially permitted in this circumstance as a concession to something or other, such as a woman captured in war, according to many views. Rebbe Shmuel, on the other hand, says there is no Torah prohibition on living with such a woman. Maybe the rabbis later, but not a Torah prohibition. And therefore, there's even some aspect of marriage to this relationship, even though it doesn't require a divorce. So it's the Mechilta of Rebbe Shmuel which stresses it doesn't need a divorce. Because the other Mechilta won't even dream that it needs a divorce. It doesn't have to mention it. It's no presumption that this is any sort of marital relationship. All right. Then there's two types of Hebrew slaves that both mention that in general the Torah deals with two types. But they mention it in a different way, because one concludes that both types are spoken of here, as I mentioned, and one concludes only one type. A female cannot sell herself into slavery. She can only be sold by her father. That's brought in Rebbe Shimon ben Yochai's. Eved Ivri means a slave who is a Hebrew, what Rashi forewarned, not a non-Hebrew required from Hebrew. That's in both. The master must treat the Hebrew slave with respect and not shame him by calling him slave. That's only found in the Mechilta Rebbe Shmuel, and there are indications in the other Mechilta, perhaps, that you may call him a slave. And there's even some text of our Mechilta that you may call him a slave. And there's a complicated discussion of the Vilna Gaon, which he refutes completely. And he claims the Vilna Gaon erred because he was going along with what they had, only one Mechilta, and kept trying to harmonize and reconcile passages which were opposite, because he didn't realize there were two schools of thought involved. And this, in general, I've noticed often in so-called Torah circles, or real Torah circles even, there is an over-tendency to try to say there are no conflicts or disagreements between different rabbinical statements. when in general we find there are many conflicts in all halachic realms. But if it comes to a non-halachic realm, an opinion on life or people or what's the right way, people often very artificially try to put everything together as though there are no disagreements. So he says the Vilna Gaon illustrates that trait among Ashkenazi scholars who unfortunately did not have the sources which would have taught them that they're dealing with divergent opinions in some cases. All right, the proselyte is included in the Hebrew slave code. The Hebrew slave sold by the court works for 6 years, either for his original master or in the event of his death for his son. That's only found in Medrash, the Mechilta of Rebbe Shmuel, because according to the one of Rebbe Shimon ben Yochai, both types of Hebrew slaves are included here. In the event of the master's death, the Hebrew slave works for his son only and not for any other heirs. A sick or runaway Hebrew slave must compensate his master according to specific regulations. The Hebrew slave serves under the same conditions as a hired workman. The 7th year means the beginning of the 7th year he goes free, not its conclusion. The 7th year means the 7th since the date of purchase, not the sabbatical year. 7 calendar years. No.
It's 7 years.
Nothing to do with the sabbatical year. People often make a mistake.
Yeah.
It's the Jubilee year which frees slaves, not the sabbatical year. The Hebrew slave, good, we got it, freed after 6 years, has no need for a bill of emancipation. That gets very complicated. There are some who held that they do need it. An unmarried Hebrew slave entering into slavery as single is subject to different laws than a married slave. The Hebrew slave retains unrevocable rights to his own body. His wife shall leave with him refers to the Israelite married to the Hebrew slave, but not to a Canaanite female slave who may have been provided for him in slavery. And that again, Yishmael has to stress because he holds there is some sort of marital relationship with this woman. The Hebrew slave's wife and children are governed by rules concerning provision for them as well as work done by them. Providing a Canaanite female slave as a mate for the Hebrew slave is optional, not obligatory. Providing a Canaanite female slave as a mate for a Hebrew slave applies also to one who serves the master's son in the event of the master's death. The Canaanite female slave provided for the Hebrew slave is to be his mate exclusively and is not to be shared by others. That's only found in the one of Rebbe Shmuel, again, which gives this some coloring of a marital relationship. If his master has given him a woman, relates to the Canaanite female slave, not an Israelite, provided as his mate during the period of his slavery. The children born to the Hebrew slave by her, whether even if it's a free Canaanite, have the status of Canaanites. A marriage,
That means they belong to the master.
if they're born of a slave. Apparently there's even a possibility of take a free Canaanite woman and make some kind of deal with her where the children will be his. A matrimonial relationship between an Israelite male and a Canaanite female slave, between any Israelite female and a Canaanite male slave, is terminated without a need for a bill of divorce. The pierced ear of the slave who wants to stay around after the 6 years and stay with his master and his Canaanite family, he must, when eventually freed at the Jubilee year, leave his acquired Canaanite family at the master's house. He can buy him back. A Canaanite slave, male or female, is not eligible for a matrimonial relationship with an Israelite. That's only found in the one of Reb Shimon ben Yochai. In order to be eligible for piercing, the Hebrew slave must repeat several times his wish to be pierced. One of them says 2 times, one says 3. Yehuda says that it's just ways of saying many times. Clear. A Hebrew female slave is not eligible for being pierced. In order to be eligible for piercing, the Hebrew slave must express his wish immediately at the close of his period of slavery, not before nor later. The piercing of the Hebrew slave is regulated by fixed limiting conditions. It's a formal ceremony with technical requirements. In the law of piercing, the term Elohim refers to the court. The term ozen, delet, and mezuzah, ear, door, and doorpost in the law of piercing have restrictive definitions. The act of piercing is performed by the master himself. The ozen, ear to be pierced, is defined in very technical ways. The marzeh, tool of piercing, is defined by specific regulations. And the pierced Hebrew slave is released in the Jubilee year or at the time of his master's death. That's it. So, without going into the text, we've just covered all of the laws of slavery, and then he goes into them in detail. You're using to be a slave to your throat today, Danny, huh?
I don't know.
You're here to say, why don't you go out and get some water or something?
Yeah, you're on straight.
Yeah. Go take some water and come back in a minute, too.
Are you open to questions?
Just about, yeah. We're just about the question part on this section. Just 1 second. I think I've spent about enough time on this subject. He has charts here showing exactly what is written in Exodus, exactly what in Deuteronomy, exactly what in Leviticus, and how the different midrashic schools deal with this problem of different aspects being mentioned in 3 different places, whether they view each as applicable to all of them, and this gets into their basic methodology, or whether they view each one as referring to only one kind of slave, and perhaps one of them to both. Okay, that's enough on this. Questions? Yes?
2 things. On the number of years that the sabbatical year was fixed, it always was the same.
Right, every 50th year was a sabbatical year.
Well, now, what about, there would be a situation where the servant would not have 6 years. What about a year before the 7th year and it'd have to go free? Nobody would want to buy that servant.
They would buy it for very little.
Value would go way down.
Yeah.
There was a scale, I suppose.
Yeah, like houses near our areas at the moment, probably.
Okay.
Yeah.
And was there some sort of ring or something placed in the ear, or just pierced?
No, it's just pierced. The Medrash says, why this mysterious ceremony of piercing the ear? He's not hearing right. God said on Sinai, the children of Israel should be servants to me, not to anybody else. A Jew should be a worker. That's why Gentiles often didn't want to hire Jews, because they go out and start their own business.
Well, specifically, isn't there an injunction in Judaism against
Mutilating the body.
Mutilating the body.
For, how should I put it, there is for mourning,
Economic.
for mourning, for doing it as a means of attacking yourself, disfiguring yourself. But here, it's, just a pierced ear. Women pierce their ears for a purpose.
And it's got
It's piercing the ear, that's all.
Oh, that's
Like for an earring, yeah. But it's a sign. It's far more dramatic doing this act than just telling him this really isn't a good thing you're doing. And it's a very dramatic ceremony. And the idea of facing such a ceremony may itself make people not make this mistake. What is it? This is the Exodus story we're doing now. And the first law we have in the Mishpatim is these slaves who you think are free are not so free. You may have taken the Jews out of Egypt, but Egypt is by no means out of the Jews yet. And there's always going to be a tendency to revert to slavery. Not to be free and independent and responsible, but to want the master, the Rebbe, the Rosh Yeshiva, the Guru, to be the one who does my thinking and feeling for me and takes responsibility for me. I'll just sit and learn, they'll give me food and clothing, and they'll tell me what to think and what to feel and so forth. Very dangerous thing until 1988. In Jerusalem, you have the same phenomenon, often under very religious auspices, where you sense a person escaping from freedom, as Eric Fromm put it so well. And the essence of Torah is all the Jews were to be free. In last week's Parshat, remember, before the calf, you don't need Levium, you don't need anything like that. Ideally, all men should be self-controlling and free, and there's a certain lack of dignity in having to have a teacher or Rebbe even. Just as all universal mankind was equal until they messed themselves up and had to have a leader. Someone having to have a leader shows there's something wrong with them. I won't go into the women's lib applications of this idea, being a traditionalist in that realm. However, we have, so the theme that happened to universal man then happened to the Jews. That they all said we will do and listen. At the end of our Parsha, in the second divine revelation, the sapphire-like revelation of God. But it happens that they really fall down, and then they have to have a class of teachers and leaders. But at the end of days, the prophet Yoel says, all your sons and daughters will be prophets. Jeremiah says, no man will have to teach his friend, because everybody will know all about God. No one will have to go up to someone else, hey, can I teach you about God? Can I inspire you? Can I make you religious? Nah, I don't need you, I can do it myself. And that's what Rav Kook said, all the chutzpah and the rebellion of our contemporary age, where children don't respect parents and pupils don't respect teachers. It's bad, it's wrong, it's terribly wrong. But there's a good sign in it that we're getting near an age where you won't need so much parents and teachers, where people will be so developed and filled with the Spirit of God that they can do their own thing without messing themselves up.
How long did this concept of servant or slavery last? When was it?
We still have it. We still have it today.
This is, well, it's not so simple. In some of the scholarly works which he discusses, they go into this and they claim that it's hard to maintain this dual situation of voluntary servitude, the one who sells himself into such a state, and court servitude, and the third thing, Canaanite slaves. So what tends to happen is either you gradually dispense with the Canaanite slaves, and that may be suggested by this Mechilta, which says only buy blue and white, only take a Hebrew slave. When you shall acquire a Hebrew slave. Sociological tendency to want to do away with Canaanite slaves, only Jewish labor. And then you may get periods where the court-sold guy almost winds up being like a Canaanite, in the basic society of Canaanite labor. It's very interesting to speculate on the correlations between sociological and economic history and the actual viability of this institution of the Hebrew servant. And again, in this book, there's many references to it. Articles written about it. I think Orbach wrote on it, Albert, and so forth.
Okay. It sounds
But
like...
why was the piercing of the ear was done at the doorpost?
Because the mezuzah is supposed to remind you of...
With the Exodus?
I would say offhand, the mezuzah is also on the doorpost, which reminds us, you can see it in Mitzrayim and so forth, the Jewish freedom and responsibility. And they put the blood on their doorpost when they went out of Egypt to show that they weren't bound to the Egyptian culture and they could make a rebellion and revolution. This guy wants to be a nice, quiet, sweet schlep of a slave. All right? God doesn't want to be a nice, quiet, sweet schlep. He wants him to be a struggling, tense, strong person who conquers himself, and in the course of that will conquer everything else.
But I think the 6 years symbolizes the 6,000 years from Adam to...
It's the 6
very
days.
nice. The
Because
6 years of
Adam became a
slavery.
slave. When he
Humankind
became
is a slave to this earth
Right.
for
He was a
6
slave to Matter.
years.
Adam became a
It's-
slave
it's
to
But
Matter.
in the 7th year he shall go free, in the 7,000, with the expansion of science and all sorts of knowledge, man will become
It's
free.
also the creation of the world, the 6 days and the 7th day is
Yeah.
Shabbat.
I'm sure it reflects
same
on
symbolism.
And we have in our parsha also reference to sabbatical years.
And then
so
talking about that, I was thinking,
That's good.
the Jews treated their slaves very nice. I was seeing some things like Roots and all about how just a little less than 100, just a little more than 100 years ago, how the blacks were
treated. It's not so correct, Danny, because we see in Jeremiah they weren't so good to their slaves. They were supposed to be, but that was the thing that brought them down. That they themselves enslaved their fellow Jews. Remember I mentioned when we learned, I believe in Va'ela, that God sends Moshe and Aaron to Pharaoh and the children of Israel to take the children of Israel out of Egypt. What do you mean to the children of Israel? Take out the children of Israel? The meaning is the danger that they will just repeat Egypt with a new set of characters. The former Hebrew slave is now the Hebrew master of other Hebrews. And this is always a danger. The Jews running from persecution elsewhere may wind up persecuting each other in the land of Israel and so forth. And of course the problems of dealing with the Arabs get involved in all these things too. Now, we're getting late, so I have to go on. Im b'gapo yavo b'gapo yetsei. This is a difficult verse. If he came in with his body, he goes out with his body, of course. It's a funny way to talk. So Rav Kanatovsky, A Night of Watching, says this means that Guf doesn't just mean the body. It means his total personality. He must still remain himself. You have to be sure that your servant doesn't lose a sense of selfhood and self-identity during those years of service. Even if he's someone who stole and so forth. Of course, someone who stole he can't control himself. He's a person who is irresponsible. So like the Jews having the Levium, and like mankind having the Jews as their priest, this guy needs a master. And, all right, all this was covered by what we did before, so let's go on to the next laws. We did everything now about a Hebrew servant. The little Hebrew servant girl is a special case where her father sells her. Better a poor family should put their girl as a servant in a good household than the modern practice that the girl from a poor wrecked family wanders the streets of Tel Aviv and winds up in a life of ill repute. And the ideal is that he or his son or somebody should marry this little girl, and then she becomes a respectable wife like any other wife. Now, I can't take another wife. There's no prohibition of polygamy in the Torah. It's only prohibited to Ashkenazim about 1,000 years ago, which prohibition expired about 10 years ago. But if he does take another wife for himself, the man who marries her, the boss or his son, she still is entitled to her full 3 basic rights of a wife. She'eva, kesusa, v'onasa, lo yigra. Her food, her clothing, which includes shelter, everything to protect her, and her periodic sexual satisfaction, he must not diminish. You want to take another wife? Right. You can afford them both, and you can give them both what you have to give them personally. Okay. Otherwise, not. Now, if none of this happens, if she doesn't go out by getting married to him or his son, or through the simple expiration of 6 years, according to those who say that applies to this case, then she just goes out once she grows up. Once she achieves puberty, she goes out. She's not to be in the position of a servant once she's achieved puberty. Okay, so that finishes pretty much the section on slaves. Then we go on to the responsible free man being responsible for all his acts. And the first act, the main act, is not to hurt another person directly. So someone who kills someone gets killed himself. But the Torah introduces something which the primitive mind was not so common. The need for intent, mens rea. That if it's not intentional, you don't kill him. And the Torah has to stress this, especially where a woman is, a married woman, an engaged woman is raped out in the field or something. The Torah stresses, it was in the field, she screamed and no one came. You must not do anything to her. And the Torah repeats and repeats and repeats. Because the ancient mind did not have our sense way after the Torah that intention is a major part of determining guilt and crime, okay? And if God made it happen, God brought him the victim, he may have been careless, but he didn't intend to kill him, so why did the guy die? So God wanted this man dead, perhaps. Or the forces of nature, you can interpret Elohim here in the impersonal sense. The laws of nature brought this victim here. Then you make a place where he can flee and do repentance, and where the family avenger can't get him. The idea, according to Tosfos at least, based on Gemara Malkus, is that the one who kills negligent homicide accidentally, really such a person has done something else wrong, and therefore God uses him as a tool perhaps, and he should repent over his whole lifestyle because this should not have happened to him. I'm not sure that's a uniform view though. Now, suppose he kills somebody on purpose and he runs into the Beit HaMikdash. Can you defile the Beit HaMikdash to have the police come in and have a big fight and take away a murderer? Torah says, take him away. Right from my altar. The altar which we mentioned before, which symbolizes love and kindness. So if you want God's love and kindness, don't need divine justice with man, humans must do justice. The church, the Catholic Church, was a sanctuary to any criminal. He could run to the church, and as long as he was there, like a consulate, you couldn't pull him out. The Torah doesn't want the religion to be a sanctuary for immoral people, as it often turns out to be. One who strikes his father or mother dies. And that's not necessarily, it's even if they're not dead, of course. Anyone if you kill them. It's if there was blood. The Golei Vish Mecharo, a kidnapper, who still has the person, dies. Someone who curses his father or mother. Similar. If people fight, and now they take a stone, like the Arabs, and he doesn't die, he's just put to bed. And then later he recovers and then dies or something. So you don't attribute it to the direct blow, and you do not kill the person who threw the stone and so forth.
You say that harsh language or cursing was capital offense?
Toward one's parents. Toward one's parents. Bear in mind, all capital offenses have to do with warning and witnesses.
Even disrespect to the person.
Disrespect is not a capital offense, but to curse them, it's like cursing yourself ultimately. You're wishing yourself death almost. The fifth commandment is honor and awe of parents. It's a pivotal point in the Ten Commandments. As Reb Soloveitchik said, the whole religious personality, all of man's human development, depends on the development of two traits, appreciation and awe of one's origins. And if one curses one's parents, you're out of the ball game. But this is only after there were witnesses and warning, and he does it. A Besdin which killed one guy in 70 years was called a murderous Besdin. All right, let's go on because it's quite late. Now, if it's his own servant he kills, he also can get the death penalty. But if the guy lingers on for a while, then we assume he didn't intend to kill him, and he's not killed for that. Now, if a pregnant woman is struck, the law is, if it causes miscarriage, there's monetary fine. Despite all the anti-abortion things, it's clear here, fetus does not have quite the status of a full live person. You are not given the death penalty for killing a fetus, unless you kill the mother. And if you do that, it's nefesh tachas nefesh, soul for a soul. Now, eye for an eye, ayin tachas ayin, an eye for an eye, shein tachat shein, a tooth for a tooth, yad tachat yad, regel tachat regel, a hand, a foot, a burn, a bruise, everything. The guy gets the same, right? So what is the law if I knock out someone's eye? Anybody?
Value, compensation.
True compensation.
How do you squeeze that into the verse? I just read an eye under an eye.
It doesn't.
So he said it's the value of an eye. Now, in Pirkei Avot we read, rabbis, be careful with your words, lest the Talmidim, the pupils learn, don't get things straight because of them. So, God should obey that rule too. So, why does God say an eye for an eye? If he means money, God should say, anything you do, pay for, say it out front, clear.
The value of
The
it.
hood of the
It's
eye
not
for
literal.
someone having one eye is worthless than having two
Yes, I
eyes.
understand that, but why say an eye for an eye? Why phrase it that way? A
Equal.
tooth for a tooth.
Equal value returned to the one that was hurt.
Well, say it that way. Say pay. Pay. That's all. That's the Torah often says pay. Huh?
Compensate.
No.
Yeah, use some word. So it's very difficult. Really difficult. So both Reb Soloveitchik and Reb Kupferman of the Mikla gave the same concept. There are three answers to this problem as I recall, or which I might be able to recall. One answer is theirs, that indeed I do owe an eye for an eye. I, God forbid, knocked out someone's eye and the court says I have to pay $100,000 and I turn it over to my insurance company and it's paid. Have I made up for it? Yes and no. I've made up in that I've done what the law requires, but I haven't really made up for it. He doesn't have an eye. There's an eye missing from this world. That eye might have painted great pictures. That eye might have seen great visions. So that eye's missing. The rabbis say it can't mean you give up your eye, because that wouldn't be justice. My eye might not be worth the same as his. He might be a great painter and I'm a nobody. My eyes aren't worth so much as his. So the Torah said you shall do justice. So it can't mean it literally. But still, why does it say it? Because still, I've deprived the world of an eye. So how do I pay it back? That is not fixed by law, which comes from the oral tradition, but it's subjective, experiential, which is prodded, the response being prodded by the written Torah. So I may donate an eye bank, I may donate my corneas for blind people after I pass away, I may help an institute for the blind, I may try to use my eyes to really do a lot with them in the world after I knocked out his eye. There's many ways it could be expressed. So what they're saying is the Torah is speaking experientially, whereas law is learned out from the oral Torah, from the tradition from Sinai through Moshe. Okay, that's one answer. The Zohar, the Kabbalistic tradition, has another answer. All right? We have a big party tomorrow, fancy guest. We bring home some cookies from the Nada Bakery on Emmett Refine, really high-class cookies. And we put them away. In the middle of the night, the little kid, 7 years old, creeps downstairs and sees the cookie jar. And by morning, there's only a half of one cookie left. He has to leave something. He's afraid to leave an empty jar, but he couldn't resist. Father and mother come down in the morning, the little kid, everybody gets up. And father sees crumbs. He sees suspicious signs. And he looks in the cookie jar, and there's only half a cookie. And he raises his hand, strapping to the kid. We bought these for the guest, and we can't eat it anymore. We're going to be embarrassed. You've done a terrible thing, and you're a glutton and a bad server. And he's about to really smash him when mommy comes down the stairs and says, "Stop! Don't hurt him. Don't do it." The little kid is frightened to death. That day doesn't feel like eating. He goes to bed sad. He'll probably never do it again. He doesn't know it's all a setup. That daddy and mommy have this prearranged, that daddy's going to put a real scare into him, and mommy's going to stop him. He's afraid maybe daddy's going to do it really, when mommy isn't around. Maybe one time mommy won't be able to stop him. So the Torah is called our Father, that which comes directly from God, and the oral law, the Talmud, which comes to us through the tradition carried on by the Jewish people, is called Mother Knesset Yisrael. Daddy said, "You knocked out, I'm going to knock out your eye if you do that." But when it actually comes down to it, and he knocked out the eye, then mommy, the oral law, comes along and says, "All right, it's enough if you just pay money. Just go without your dessert today and go to bed early." And it's father and mother. That's the second answer, okay? The third answer is my own. There's a difference between oral and written law. Oral law is only for the Jewish people. By these words, the mouth of these words, I've made a covenant with you, God says. That's oral law. Written law, God anticipated Mr. Gideon, and he knew everybody at some point would have Bibles in their homes and so forth. And he knew, and I would say even perhaps intended, that his Torah reached the whole world. It was a controversy when they translated it to Greek, whether it was a joyous or a sad occasion, perhaps the circumstances, but anyway, God anticipated the whole world would get it. For the Jewish people who adopt all these Mishpatim, all 613 mitzvahs of which they're getting a sample now, for them you don't have to have such strict laws. They're disciplined folk. Occasionally something will go wrong, so they'll pay some money. However, the non-Jews who don't accept all these laws, their societies have been and will be much more violent. They're simply not as trained in self-control and discipline. Therefore, for them, maybe the message should be an eye for an eye. And when they cut off someone's hand for a small theft in Saudi Arabia, it's quite unjust and cruel vis-a-vis the size of the crime. But it's a loving, kind, sweet law when you view it in terms of the overall effect on society. Because by cutting off a hand or two occasionally, many people's lives are saved. And far more horrible things are avoided because people don't commit the crimes. Then you can leave your door open in Saudi Arabia, from what I understand. So, vis-a-vis the individual criminal, it's harsh, unjustly harsh. However, for the good of the whole society, it's quite kind, because less people die. Very simple.
But there is this prison, like that where people are constantly fearing, if they do that, they have so
Yes,
don't
again,
leave.
the higher the level of the people, the less that their duties have to be reinforced by punishment. It's self-decision rather than the fear of punishment which motivates them. The slave, you also give duties to. You may not do this, you must do this, but you do it via punishment. It's not expected that will be integrated into his mind and soul. Okay, so much for that subject. So I gave you 3 answers on that one. Now, if you destroy the tooth or eye of your own heel, non-Jewish slave, the Canaanite slave, it goes free. A Jewish slave does not go free. You know, money or something, I presume, but that's it. So we finish with the damage you do to other people. Then we go to the damage that your animals or property does to other people. And we speak of when your cow gores a man or a woman and they die. You kill the cow. That which destroyed a human being is not that it's guilty, but it's not to be left around. The same as an animal with whom sexual relations were held by a human. And its flesh may not be, but nothing happens to the owner, because who expected this cow to go and gore someone? But if it was a nasty cow, which has done this already 3 times, 3 strikes and you're out, and he didn't guard it properly, then he is responsible and has to pay. But we also figure in the value of the carcass in determining the payment.
Does the elder wittingly or unwittingly apply in both of these?
Well, if he wasn't careless at all, if he did then build a big pen for his cow, so there's nothing to get him for. But it says he didn't watch it. And he has to pay. He really should die if his cow killed someone else after it had done things 3 times. But he can redeem himself by paying. And same thing if it's a child. Now, if the cow kills someone else's servant, he has to recompense that person for the money he lost. If a man opens a pit, same kind of laws. He has to watch it. You presume people can fall in pits. The tragic death of the boy in the old city, 12 years old, because the city didn't put fences around the pits in their new park, opposite the parking lot. And when an animal will gore another animal, that's a little more prevalent than it will attack a human being and die. So you split the value of the live animal and also the dead animal. However, if again it was a 3-time loser, then he has to pay. Now, if a man will steal an animal and slaughter it or sell it, as long as he doesn't slaughter or sell it, you think maybe he's going to give it back, maybe he'll do tshuva. If he puts it beyond himself to do tshuva, then he has to really pay. He has to pay 5 times for a cow and 4 times for a sheep. The rabbi says sheep is a little less because it's a little more difficult to deal with, and he's already suffered somewhat. Interesting concept in general. If a thief is found breaking in under circumstances where it's clear as sun that he's not out to kill you, and then you kill him, you're liable. But if there's any possibility he's out to kill you, if you stop him, you don't have to say, I'll run away and then take my property. You can defend yourself, and you can kill him in the process if you have to. And you have done nothing wrong. When,
How can you determine?
you have to. That's what the Torah says. So, if you don't know who it is or anything, then you go ahead and kill him if you have to. Try to shoot him in the leg, but if you can't, like if you see someone going to rape or murder, you have to stop him. He may be out to kill you. However, if it's your own son who steals from you, such things happen, or your parent, or whatever, you know that if they're caught and you defend yourself, you have a right to defend your property. But you know they're not going to kill you. So then you have no right to kill them. Okay? That's how the Talmud interprets these verses. They speak of daytime and nighttime, but it's metaphor, according to the Talmud. Again, like eye for an eye. Same thing happens if you send out a fire. You're responsible for your fires. Okay? Then we get to the 4 shomrim, the cases where someone gives me his thing to hold by me. And there are 4 possible cases. An unpaid custodian. Please, watch my cow, I got to run to town. A paid custodian. Watch my cow, I got to run to town. Here, take $1 for your trouble. Parking lot. A borrower, let me use your cow for a day. And a renter. Avis, rent a cow. I go over and say I need a cow for a day. Fine, pay us $10. The degrees of responsibility vary with these 4 cases. What you're getting out of it, what the other guy's getting out of it. How did the damage occur? Through accident, through theft, through actual negligence on your part, so forth. And the various cases discussed, it's not so clear what's the law where I rent a cow, whether in such a case it's like a paid bailment or an unpaid bailment. But the Masechtot of the Talmud and the Zikin deal with these problems. And oaths are taken when necessary to establish the truth, and everything has to come to court and the judges decide if the parties cannot agree. Let's see what's next. I think we're almost done. Then another type of damage, which is a more subtle one, comes at the end, where a sweet young thing, a virgin, goes out, meets a big city slicker, and he seduces her. All right? He's now cut off her value on the marriage market. So he's caused financial damage to her father, who normally would get that money, and he has to marry her if they so wish. Now, in those times, that wasn't so terrible because he could take other wives too, but he has to take responsibility. He's made her marriage prospects much worse, so that's it. Okay. One detail I didn't mention, if you borrow something and the owner stays around with it, it's like he's watching it, so you're less responsible then. Now, next. Now come a bunch of things where you've not only hurt someone else, but you've self-destructed. You've done something which is basically so immoral that, and perhaps one of these things can lead to the other, that you can no longer live. One of them is witchcraft, which I would briefly define as an intimate connection with the earth, the animal, the earthly part of oneself, which is then used to manipulate physical reality. And then right after that comes sexual relations with animals. Apparently the two are
How do
connected.
you define something like that? Sleeping with an animal, would it be the outcome of the AIDS now?
Maybe. I mean, the
Because
thing
how
in
we-
Sodom and Gomorrah
Yeah.
is that they took AIDS over aid. That somehow the dehumanization which comes from not being kind may lead to the dehumanization of all sorts of other types. I don't know. Anyways, you shall not let a witch live. It's apparently more than just killing her. You have to root her out. You have to make a witch hunt. And we had a case like that. And you have to watch out about these things. There's the Jewish girl goes to the Peace Corps, and her mother meets her at the airport. She walks down the plank with this big black guy with all sorts of funny marks on his face, and the mother starts screaming, "I told you to marry a rich doctor, not a bitch doctor." So anyway, this story. But seriously, when we come to something like "you shall not let a witch live," what's the first question that comes to your mind?
Salem trials.
Yeah, not the first association, the first question.
Oh, question.
If I tell you, you shall not let a witch, I mean, they got this from the Bible. They got it messed up. They didn't have the oral tradition. But the Puritans and Pilgrims really tried. They were on the right track. They established America according to the Tanakh. It's our first major success in Ki Mitziot Tetzei Torah Dvar Hashem Yerushalayim. But when I tell you, you may not let a witch live, what question immediately rises to your mind?
Saving trouble to myself and the world.
Yeah, that's comments, but what question?
What constitutes
A witch. I give you an order. Don't what? If somebody puts on a witch costume for Purim, you should throw the little kid down the well or something. Of course not. What is a witch? If somebody just starts riding a broomstick, what is it? What the hell?
A witch
Which
is,
witch? An evil
a witch
thing?
is someone who pronounces the curse and it happens.
Rides a
It's an evil
broomstick.
thing. It's
Oh.
an evil thing.
Is Bilam a witch?
Yes.
Something
Are we supposed to
bad.
kill him? I don't know.
Something bad.
A
Something
fortune
that-
teller.
Fortune teller? Yeah, right. Is a
but
fortune teller?
an
A
introduction of-
TV.
All right, now, how, since we're discussing law and legal systems today, if I give you a law and it has unclear terminology, okay? Yeah, you better move over a little, you don't want anyone else to catch what you got. If I give you a law and you don't understand something, how do you find out what is meant by the law? The law was written 200 years ago, say. How do you find out the meaning of it?
Test case.
Test case. You look for a case where experts in the law actually applied this law, okay? That's what you do. So, do we have a case where they killed a witch? Somebody responsible? Yes, we do. It's in the Talmud. Reb Shimon ben Shattach, who was Shlomo Alexandra's brother, he was the head of the Sanhedrin at a time when the whole Jewish establishment had gone Sadducee. The Sanhedrin itself was Sadducee. And he brought it back to the good guys, the Pharisees. And he got a report that there were 80 witches in a cave in Ashkelon, a Playboy club, call it what you want, where you had to have a passkey or something to get in. And he went to investigate. He thought this was a real serious threat to the country. It's not enough you wait till a case comes before you. You shall not let them live. It's a real danger. We still haven't quite defined it, but we'll see from this story. I'll tell you, it's a cute story. It's getting late. We're almost done, but this story is an important story. Wow, there was a lot of it. The story is like this. He immediately took 80 of his pupils, and he told them to take it was rainy winter season. He told them to take their coats and put them inside a clay pot, put the clay pot over their heads, and to follow him. He did likewise. And he got up to where the witches were, and he quickly threw the pot away and took the coat out and knocked on the door, and they said, "Who is it?" And he just let anybody into this group. They said, "I'm a witch like you." You see, a witch can be a male. They speak of the female, the Talmud says, only because it's more frequent, but not the law applies only to a female. Now, they said, "Prove it." They said, "Open up." And he says, "Look, I'm dry. I walk between the raindrops." That's one quality that a good witch can do. And he said, "Now show me what you can do." I guess he wanted to see if this was really true. If it's just sleight of hand, that's not a witch. Not like my mom used to say these things aren't real. It's very difficult to say that. We have Pharaoh's magicians and so forth. So they said, "Yeah." And they produced bread and wine out of nothing. Right? So he saw that it was real. He says, "Now I'll show you something I can really do. I will bring to you 80 other witches, handsome, beautiful young men, and you'll have fun with them." So we see that they were sexually loose. A witch you shall not let live. Anyone who sleeps with an animal shall be put to death. All right? And they said, "Great, you're on." And he whistled, it's the prearranged signal. He whistled once, and they took off their pots and put on their coats. He whistled twice, and they came running up, and as his instructions, each one of them hugged one of these jet-set ladies. Each of his great pupils in the yeshiva hugged one, and lifted her up, and hung her, and killed her on the spot. Apparently it was such a threat and cold that if he would have waited for normal trial, they would have been rescued by the underworld of Tel Aviv or Eilat or whatever. Now, so that's the story. The sequel to the story is that the relatives of these witches framed Reb Shimon ben Shattach's son. They said he violated Shabbos or something. They brought witnesses so that he would be killed. And as he went out to die, he said, "Look, if," and they couldn't shake them. He says, "If these people are telling the truth, may my death not atone for me. And if not, they should get it." And they broke down and confessed. Then his father said, "We'll take him back." But he said, "No, don't do it, Daddy. They'll say I have protected you. And you're trying to establish the rule of Torah law in this land, better I should die at this point." What actually happened, I don't recall. But now, what do we learn from this story? A, that there is such a thing as witchcraft and it's real. It involves connection to the earth. Why did the yeshiva boys hug these creatures? Certainly not a nice thing to do. Because they had to be disconnected from the ground before they would lose their abnormal power so they could be hung up. All right? And all normal laws of evidence and everything were somewhat suppressed here, that they killed more than one person in the day and it was done at night. I shouldn't say laws of evidence, but laws of judicial procedure.
Did you say it was a midrash or in the Talmud?
It's in the Talmud. It's brought as proof for certain problems relating to judging more than one person in a day and doing judgment at night and so forth. So I would say it's an authentic story. And that's our case history. So we see that there's apparently, just like a person can transcend this earth and normal laws of science and nature by getting close to God in heaven and really immersing himself in them, Choli Hamago and so forth. Also, a person can transcend the normal laws by becoming really into the earth. And then he acquires all sorts of mysterious powers of earthiness and animal nature, which a normal person wouldn't have. Now, so we could define witchcraft now as the manipulation of nature or the changing of things according to formula and secret knowledge. So maybe we should kill every physicist and biologist and chemist. In other words, what is the difference definitionally between witchcraft and science? Science also manipulates nature. It doesn't just let it go the way God wanted it. It manipulates nature, makes all kinds of changes, maybe as impressive as making the bread. I'd say transmitting a video signal by satellite from the Great Synagogue in France to the Great Synagogue in Jerusalem last week, and vice versa, having a simulcast was maybe as incredible as bringing bread and wine out of nothing. They all dealt with bread and wine, physical things. You see, they wanted free sex. It's all this becoming, letting all your animal passions really go, and that gives you certain cocoa. So I'm trying to differentiate, but it's not so simple. So you have to say the scientist is working with laws which God intended for normal, intelligent man. But there's another distinction made, because then you get into another problem. Who's another group of people who manipulate nature according to mysterious things? Reb Sharabi, Abu Salah, what do they call them? Baba Sali, Hasidic rabbis. They do all kinds of charms and amulets.
So but they are venerated people. You could.
What is the difference between them and a witch? So you have
So they do blessing.
that
Which
is
is
what's
good.
given. Some say there is no difference. It's also using these mysterious powers.
It's
But it's a
divine.
question of whether you're doing it for good or doing it for bad. So then I could apply that to science too. Maybe a scientist is a witch too when he uses science like Russian psychiatry to persecute people or to make chemical bombs for the Germans or something. So it could be.
One learned the Torah and the other one learned science. You
Yeah,
know,
but I have
without
one
learning
too.
the Torah.
Yeah,
That
that's
Baba
interesting.
Sali learned the Torah.
Yeah, fine, but he's manipulating nature in magical ways.
You
I
know-
don't know. I'm just raising the question. So I would say there's two possible distinctions. One is using the normal laws of nature, the logic, God's Torah of nature, which he gave along with the Torah, science versus magic. And the other thing is in terms of if it's used beneficially or harmfully.
Yeah.
Okay, no time. Now, anyone sacrifices to anything other than God is a curse. And the Torah stresses you were once strangers in Egypt, so you mustn't be bad to the strangers. And of course that affects again how we deal with the Arabs today. I mean, the problem for the religious Jew, for the non-religious Jew, how you deal with the Arabs is a political problem. His morality may be affected, but the heck with morality, I gotta live here, I'll kill him if necessary. For the religious Jew, he has a much deeper problem. If he's bad to the Arab, God might get mad at him and be bad to him. If he doesn't keep the Torah well, God may favor the other one. We'll see soon. God promises, if you keep all my laws, all the going will be afraid of you here and they won't have any problems. But if you don't,
That's what we're supposed to learn.
But we are doing what the Torah said, didn't the
yeah,
Torah
right,
say?
right. Maybe the Arabs would accept us as their leaders if we were really the magnificent models of a kingdom of priests and a holy nation that the Torah expects us to be. One mustn't afflict also a widow and an orphan. And if you do and they cry to me, God says, I listen. And then your children and wives can become orphans and widows. If you lend to the poor, don't take any interest. Of course, for business loans, we have a heter iska. And if you have to take a pledge, you're allowed to take a pledge. You want to be sure to get your money back. But if it's something the guy needs, his tools or his cloak, which he sleeps in, you have to give it back whenever he needs it, take it back again. Even though by law, maybe it should be yours, but God is merciful. And God doesn't want you to act just according to strict letter of the law. If you do, he'll act that way to you, and everybody's got plenty of things they can get in trouble with the law with God. Mustn't curse judges or princes. There keeps society going. That's the other side of it. You can't let the Arabs block the roads and burn tires and destroy the authority of the country. So we have to be a combination. A sensitive religious Jew has to be a combination of Techiyah and those b'shalom. On the one hand, he has to be for law and order and make sure that nobody can destroy the country and make it unlivable. The Arab causes trouble, maybe you'll deport him, kill him, who knows what you'll do. On the other hand, he has to be like Oz B'Shalom. He has to worry that he treats the stranger in his land well. And as long as a particular Arab has done nothing wrong, you have no right to hurt him. I don't know if we have a right to wreck an Arab house because one of their teenage kids did something to us. Who can control their teenagers? The Jews can't either. Now,
But the Torah does say we must get rid of
the Canaanites, we'll come to that. Why? Because they're idol worshippers who will drive you away. The Arabs don't do that. They're not idol
But
worshippers.
your enemies, they say.
No, it
Torah
says, you'll see in a moment, it says very specifically because they'll bring you to idol worship. That's the reason. And otherwise, you'll work something out with them. And all the agricultural dues have a certain order. Trumas first, and Mises and so forth. Each year by itself, that has to be kept. All right. When you have a little baby animal, like a little baby human, 6 days it's with its mother, bonding, the God of nature takes over. Then the transcendental God comes in on the 7th day, and from that time on he can be it's Shiva Shemim, 7 days he's with his mother. And on the 8th day, transcendental time, it's fit for sacrifice. In the case of a human, the minor sacrifice of circumcision. Okay? The parallel is very interesting. Little baby animals, little baby humans, 7 days to stay with mommy. And at that time, even if there's not a drop of blood, she's forbidden to daddy. That's her bonding time with the child. From the 8th day on, she has to give him up somewhat. She has to learn. She's raising him to give him up to the public. In Israel, where boys go in the army, that's really especially meaningful. And then she has to return to her husband. And according to the strict Torah law, before rabbinical things got involved, even if she's bleeding like a river, they say, she may live with her husband. God's so concerned that the husband-wife relationship be resumed, and that's the best thing for the child. Not that she forget about her husband, she has a real baby now, not a pseudo baby.
Doesn't the lap up to 40 days?
That's today. That's what I'm telling you. No, those days are till she can go into Beit HaMikdash, but it's only 40 and 80. But 7 and 14 till she returns to her husband. We call that pure blood, even though she's bleeding at that time, she can live with her husband. Later, rabbinical things in Jewish custom modified it. But the Torah's scheme, the ideal scheme, was, for example, that Nidah is only 7 days. That's it. There's no clean days or anything. As today, where it's 12 and 14. V'yanshe kodesh to you li, and you shall be holy people to me, and you mustn't eat of an animal which was going to die anyway, a wounded animal, and so forth. Treifa goes to the dog. They say because the dogs didn't bark at the Jews when they left Egypt, it's a little difficult unless you do all dogs as brethren. So these dogs that you're giving to her are probably not the descendants of the Egyptian dogs.
Did it say after 7 days that she has to go to the mikveh?
Yes,
After 7 days?
after 7 days she goes to the
immerse?
mikveh. Yes, she immerses, yes, but no clean days unless it's an abnormal bleeding of Zavah. Now, you mustn't have any false rumors. Testimony must be honest. You mustn't go together with a wicked person to plot false testimony. This is addressed basically to judges and witnesses and so forth. You do not follow the majority for evil, yet the majority of judges must prevail. You mustn't honor a poor person. Justice and charity are two different things. You want to help the poor person, you help him. But if he owes someone else money, you have to rule that way. And if you meet an animal of your neighbor who is lost or falls under his load, you have to help. It's a special mitzvah to help if it's your enemy. Your enemy's ox or donkey. Because then you're doing two mitzvahs. You're rectifying a situation and you're making peace. You shall not, on the other hand, ignore the poor because they have no influence. You have to be very careful to achieve justice. Now comes a famous verse, which I'm going to skip over quick. V'davar sheker tirchak. Stay away from a matter of falseness. Is that a basic principle in the Torah? No. According to most, no. Other sources, common sense would say you shouldn't lie with your divine speech. From a false matter, stay away. Speak is a technical thing to just address the judges. There's no time to go into it. Gemara Shavuot, page 31, you'll find a whole list of interpretations which relate to judges and their assistants and witnesses and so forth. There is one application, though, that Hillel and Shammai have a fight. When we go to the wedding of an ugly bride, what are we supposed to do at a wedding? Dance, sing. What do we sing to the bride? Kate said Meraglim with the Akala. How do we dance before the bride? The Gemara asks.
Praises.
What praises? Ketzam Ragli Lifnei Hakala. What comes next in the song? Ketzam Ragli Lifnei Hakala. Kalana, Halana, V'Chalasida, right? A beautiful and sweet or kind bride. She's ugly. So whose ruling is that? That's Hillel's ruling. Shammai brings our pasuk midvar sheker tirchai, even from a word which means falseness, stay away. You don't do it. All right. So Hillel puts peace above truth, and Shammai puts truth above peace. I have the source on this week's sheet. And if a person's declared innocent, if someone then thinks why he should be guilty, forget it. God will take care of him if he's guilty. On the other hand, if someone's condemned guilty, like Rav Shimon Shotach's son, then suddenly a judge thinks of a cause for innocence, bring him back again and free the man. And you, again, mustn't oppress the stranger. You know the soul of the stranger. Before we were speaking probably about external oppression. Now I have a hunch we're speaking about emotional affliction. You have to be very sensitive to how you talk to a convert. You know the soul of the convert because you once again were strangers in Egypt. Then we have the 6 years of the 7th year of the sabbatical year, and Shabbat, followed by the 3 pilgrimage festivals, Pesach, Sukkot, and Shavuos. And Pesach must always be in springtime, and the calendar has to be adjusted so that the lunar and solar calendars meet, so that will happen. The physical redemption of nature has to correspond to the spiritual redemption of the Jewish people, and Sukkot must always be in the fall. All right, and that is almost it. The first fruits are discussed briefly, and you must not cook a cow in its mother's milk, and Jews and idolaters don't go together in the cooking pot or in the melting pot of life either. So no pacts may be made with idolaters. And this is what you're referring to. When you come to Israel, you cannot tolerate idolatry here. Okay? And if you do listen to God, God will make all your enemies afraid of you, and you'll win and all. So if we're having trouble with the Arabs, I think these verses are a clear sign.
Right.
It's because we are not living as we should.
In fact,
It's their fault too, maybe.
They're having trouble with us.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if I go that far. But at least a major component is we're not in shape. Because at least their fear, they'll be afraid of us if we were. Now, and you must follow my angel. This refers to Moshe, or the angel Michael, who's going to guide you to the land. God predicts that they are going to get bad, and God won't be able to be so direct and close to them. And when you get to the land, you mustn't adopt their ways, thinking they know what's good for Israel, how to live here. You must become Canaanites, not worship their idols, right? And then, if you worship God, I'll bless your bread and your water, and there will be no sickness and no miscarriages, and you'll live your full allotted number of days, and again, they'll all be afraid of you. All right? And all your enemies will flee from you. And I'll send the hornet after them to make sure they don't come back. But we'll do it gradually, because God does not want to kill all the wild animals of Israel. Maybe an ecological consideration, I don't know. And you'll have your borders from the Red Sea until the Philistine Sea, and from the desert to the river, I guess the Euphrates. And I'll give all the inhabitants of the land in your hand. You'll drive them away. Why? You mustn't make any deal with them and their gods. They shall not live in your land. Why? Because the PLO know. Because they will make you sin and go away from my Torah, because you will worship their gods. So Rav Kook, the Ohr Chaim, and so forth said there's no problem with Arabs living here, because they're not idolaters. And they will be a trap for you. And to Moshe, he said, go up to the mountain, you and Aaron, Nadav, and Avihu. At that time, Nadav and Avihu were the successors for Moshe and Aaron. Not Lazar and Itamar. It's only when the others died, because their pride and success went to their heads, that the other brothers were chosen. And 70 elders, and then Moshe alone will get close to God and not them. And the people shouldn't go up at all. And Moshe told the people all the words of God and the laws, and they all said with one voice, no Levium, now nothing, all together, everything which God said we will do. And then Moshe wrote all down a book and gave it to them, a teaching. And then they said, not only will we do all that God said, but we'll hear it, we'll learn about it too. Naaseh bin Nishma. And they made altars and sacrifices for the 12 tribes. The youth did it because it was pretty hard work too, and had to be done maybe quickly. And Moshe, half of the blood he sprinkled on the altar, and half later went on the people. And then Moshe told them, this is the blood of the covenant which God has made with you, implying it's a bloody sacrificial covenant, the message of circumcision, Abraham's message. We're sacrificing every day to carry it out here to try to build a model state of Israel that will spread Torah to the whole world, from the kingdom of the priest and the holy nation. And then Moshe and Aaron, Nadav and Abihu, and the 70 elders went up, and they saw a vision of the Lord of Israel, and under his feet, so to speak, was a sapphire work like the purity of heaven, something very amazing, and they survived. Nothing happened to them. And by Yechazu et Elokim, and they saw God, and what was their response? Well, they ate and drank. Some say it's for this that none of the view were eventually killed. They were put on probation as soon as they messed things up by the dedication of the Mishkan. God didn't want to spoil this day of revealing of the Torah. That was more important than the dedication of the Mishkan. But they were put on probation and killed later. And most commentators condemn them for eating and drinking at such a moment. However, the Ramban, who generally is the most against the body, and he says, get away from your body and be as aesthetic as possible. He didn't like sex, he didn't like indulgence in anything. But he said, but when you finish a godlike experience, learning a tractate in the Talmud, finishing the Torah, seeing God, then you make a party. So he defends them for eating and drinking. He says, this is the source for making a party when we finish a Masechet. And God told to Moshe, now you come up alone, and I'll give you the tablets. All they heard was the 10 Commandments from the sky up till now. They didn't have tablets. I'll give you the Torah and the mitzvah, the written, the oral law, which I've written to teach them. And Moshe got up, and Moshe his servant, and Moshe went to the mountain of God, and he told the elders to stay there until we come back, and I'm leaving 2 deputies, Aaron and Hur. What was Hur's other role? He was also the deputy who held up Moshe's hands with Aaron. Back a little while ago in the war with Amalek. What happens to Hur after this? We don't hear a word. And my son Ariel asked me, why didn't Hur protest against the calf, or why wasn't he involved in it like Aaron? Well, yeah, the answer is simple. The rabbis say, because Hur was killed when he did protest against the calf. And that's what made Aaron decide he has to go along with them and stall until Moshe comes back. So this is the last we hear of Hur, okay? And anyone who has problems will go to them. Moshe went up, and the cloud covered the mountain, and God's cloud came down on Sinai. 6 days, and he called to Moshe on the 7th day, again preparation. And the vision of the glory of the God was like a fire on top of the mountain. In the eyes of all of Israel, they saw it. Not they heard, someone said he rose or something like that. They saw it. The whole people of Israel saw our vision. The Christians never can make up such a vision, or the Muslims, because it never happened. You can't make up such a story. People would laugh at you, the Kuzari says. If God appeared to all my people, I would have heard about it already from my father. You don't have to tell me about it. And that's why the Christians and Muslims could make up a story. Some people came and said he did miracles, God changed his mind, but they could never make up a story like this, because you can't make it up if it didn't happen. And Moshe went in the middle of the cloud and up in the mountain, and he was there 40 days and 40 nights, and that finishes our Parsha. And we'll just say maybe one word on the Haftorah. Does anyone know offhand what is the Haftorah for this week?
It must be Isaiah.
Isaiah, right. What's it about? Do you know offhand? Pretty good guess.
No.
I don't remember either, frankly. Let me see if I got my sheet here. There is no Haftorah. Here we go. Last year's giant Parsha poster. Our Haftorah. No, it's not Isaiah, I'm sorry. Jeremiah 34, 8:22.
The Hebrew slave.
Yeah, about how the Jews are going to go back to exile because they didn't free their fellow brothers, the thing I mentioned before. They freed them, they took them back again as slaves under technicalities. So they created a new Egypt in the state of Israel, which had all the wrong values, so they needed another dose of Golas. Fine. And then there is a new covenant with King Tzidkiyahu, but they quickly alter that also and go back to the ways of having master slaves among Jews. And God warns them, sword, pestilence, and famine are coming. And the religious political leadership were equally guilty. All their leaders were part of the plot, religious and political. And so Babylonia will capture their kings and princes, and birds and animals will devour their carcasses, and Jerusalem will be burnt, Judea desolate. Now, the rabbis, when they made up the Haftorah, suddenly did one little thing here. That was the end of chapter 34. They then went back to chapter 33 and brought its 2 verses, 25 and 26, because they didn't want to end on a sad note, neither do I. Nevertheless, God says his covenant with Israel and David will endure as long as the universe. And they shall return to the state of Israel, from which they eventually will shape up and teach and redeem all mankind. That's it.
Amen.
Any questions or comments? Now,